In today's video, we're going to look at the difference between dynamic and formal equivalency in translations and how that relates to Bible study, as well as what a board game can teach us about these two concepts. Let's dive in. Hi, my name is Chris Wilson and I make videos on church tech, Bible study and note-taking systems. Now, my family are real fans of board games. When I first came to Poland, when I was dating my wife and we weren't married at the time, I wanted to buy a board game that would be useful, interesting and fun for us to play with her family as well. And so I picked up this board game called Ticket to Ride, in fact the 20th anniversary edition, so that we'd have this special version we could play. Now when I had it, I was very new to Polish, I didn't really speak much Polish, and I took it round to my in-laws' house when we were still seeing each other, and we were playing it and I noticed that the name of the game did not have the words for ticket or ride that I knew. Ticket is bilet in Polish, and there just wasn't this word there in the title. Instead, it had a very different title. It was called Wsiąść do pociągu. And I thought that's really strange. Like, what's going on here in the name of this game? Why hasn't it got the word ticket when I know the word for ticket and I can see it's not here? So I asked about it. What do these words mean? What is the literal meaning of this name, this title? And but I didn't ask that way. I asked, what does Wsiąść do pociągu mean? And what happened next was my in-laws started to sing. And that's because it's actually a really good translation. Now, if you say to an English-speaking person, Ticket to Ride, they're instantly going to think of the Beatles song. In the same way, if you say Wsiąść do pociągu to a Polish person, they're instantly going to think of this classic song from the past. And that is the element that the translator managed to communicate there. They didn't use a literal translation where each word is translated across. Instead, they managed to convey that cultural idea that is at the heart of the name of the game. They managed to get that nostalgic idea across in their translation. So this is where we would look at the difference between a formal translation, where you are taking each word and you're trying to get it as close to each word as possible, versus a dynamic translation, where you're trying to get the general idea and translate that across. Now this is very common in Bible translations. We tend to find that a translation tends to skew towards one end or the other. So if we're going to talk about something like the New American Standard Version, this is New American Standard Bible, so NASB. This translation tends to focus on being a formal equivalent translation. It tries to translate words as closely to the original word as possible. And it tries not to be creative with their grammar, tries not to interpret things loosely. Now, if you go to the other end of the scale, you would have something like The Message, although you could argue that that isn't even trying to be dynamic. You could argue it's gone beyond that. Or NLT is another example that's often given, which is a translation where they will add more words in, they'll take out words, they'll change whole sentence structures to try and convey a point, to try and express it as it would be expressed today. So the kind of idea is, how would someone write this today versus how can we get it as close to what they wrote as possible? There are real difficulties, even on the formal end of translation. It's really difficult to say that this is an exact formal translation because grammar between languages is different. You know, in English we have different grammatical tenses than they had in Greek or Hebrew. And sentence structure can be different. That means that it's really tricky to even formally translate something, to translate it word for word. You know, the order could be different. You may not convey a wordplay that is there in the original language as well. So that brings us to the question, which is better, formal or dynamic equivalency, or somewhere in between in the middle? Now, lots of people will give you their own opinions and they'll base them in some good reasoning and good logic. I'm going to tell you my opinion right now, and I think it may be wrong, but I think it's important to think about these things at least. So I like what we do in my church when it comes to translation. Now, my church is bilingual, Polish and English, and we have a preacher and we have a translator standing alongside them at the same time. And it's really interesting looking at the action that goes on, because it's not like one of these situations where people have a headset and they can listen to the translation that's being simultaneously done. Instead, there's actually sometimes interaction between the preacher and the translator. And what will happen is sometimes someone will say a very English expression or American expression, South African expression we've even had. And so then the translator has a decision, what do I do? What do I do with this expression? There's no literal equivalent in Polish. It could even be a word play. So what should I do? And generally, what the translators do is they will literally translate it word for word, and then they will give an equivalent expression in their own language. And in my opinion, I think that actually is a really great approach. You retain the original example, but you also express the idea across as well. And it works so well for when we're translating our sermons. And sometimes some really interesting information can come out of that. You know, like in Polish, they don't have two words for these different things. They only have one word. Or in English, we only have one word, but in Polish, they have separate words for these ideas. And that can actually be really influential and really revelatory to us listening to the sermon. And I think this approach works well for Bible study. You know, you want the original words so that you can notice these patterns, so that you can notice these themes that are going on, but you also want the ideas, the expressions, the equivalent cultural connotations that are there. And that's where some of these extra resources, these Bible study resources, a translation where they include the notes from it can come in handy. So in general, my idea is you want something which gives you the original version, but you also want notes which explain and clarify cultural ideas and themes and equivalent expressions as well. It's kind of a cheat answer. I'm basically saying both. And I think that really is a great thing, especially for English speakers when it comes to Bible translations. We do have this wealth of options out there. We can use something like the Message to try and look at how someone has interpreted this passage completely differently than the original thing, how they've reworded it. And we can look at that and we can perhaps gain some new insight into the original verse, or just have our perspective shifted from something that we've read many times. However, we can also then come to perhaps a more formal equivalent translation, and we can see word for word, and we can notice these patterns that the writer intended to be picked up on that have been repeated again and again. I'd love to know your perspective on this issue. If you have a favorite translation, or if you prefer a more formal or dynamic equivalent version. Now, in the next video, I'm going to look at some different English translations and look at some examples of formal and dynamic equivalency in action, and we can see how it plays out in reality. If you've enjoyed this video, I'd really like it if you gave it a thumbs up, consider subscribing to make sure that you get more content. I put a new video out every Monday or so. Thank you for watching. Hope to see you next time.